Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. So, in the last few episodes, I've been talking a lot about, some of the principles in being a good dad, in parenting. And part of that, obviously, is a process of being self-aware and being emotionally well-regulated. But one of the elements that I want to focus on today is probably one of the most challenging aspects for many of us, and that's the principle of acceptance. These days when many of us are trying to practice mindfulness and meditation, that issue about acceptance often is raised, and it becomes an interesting discussion. A lot of people find that want to control negative experiences, and so some of those negative experiences exist in the relationship with our partner or in our relationship with our children. And it's interesting because that whole problem of controlling, suppressing, or repressing feelings generally, not all the time, but generally, begins to make the problem often worse. We need to accept that negative experiences are ultimately inevitable. Yet despite that, we often try to fight and avoid them. Now, paradoxically, a lot of research has repeatedly shown that trying to control and to avoid negative experiences often increases their intensity. So, what do? Well, a different way of dealing with emotions is through acceptance. And I often talk about that. But one of the things I want to do in this particular podcast is to take you through a metaphor. And I want you to really pay attention to the metaphor and how this fits with your experience. Okay? So let me set the scene. I want you to try and imagine pushing a ball underwater. Now, most of you have tried that, and I watch the kids do it all the time. You soon recognize that it's a very strenuous activity. It requires continuous force and energy. And even when you succeed, it's not easy to keep the thing in one place. It wants to move up, and it wants to move around, and eventually, quite often, we lose a grip on it. Okay? Now, you could argue that the same process is at work when I'm trying to push away thoughts and feelings. The thoughts and feelings are like the ball. So suppressing them can be the same as trying to push a ball underwater, where the ball just doesn't want to necessarily go and stay. Now, the water represents our consciousness. Just like it's possible to push the ball underwater, it's possible to suppress thoughts and feelings. However, when we do that, it can have some seriously negative effects on our overall well-being. The process of suppression is difficult, and it really does require a great deal of energy. Just like we're unable to push the ball underwater all the time, we often fail to continuously suppress our experiences, our thoughts, our feelings. And despite our best efforts, we then still get confronted with our anxious thoughts or painful settings. Now, this is particularly relevant when I work with people who are experiencing intrusive thoughts when they're highly anxious. So most of the time, most of us, when we start feeling anxious, we want to go, oh, I don't want to feel like that. And so we firstly try to suppress the anxiety, and then these thoughts pop into our head. So the next thing is we're trying to suppress the feelings, but we're also trying to suppress the thoughts. Now, the more you try that, the more energy it's going to take. And the more likely this stuff is to pop back up to the surface. Now, you need to recognize that sometimes there is a place for suppression, but it's also important to note that that's really just a short-term solution. It is not something that will work in the long term. So, using the ball and water metaphor, the ball will continue to exist as long as you hold it and try to control it. So the alternative is to begin to focus on accepting thoughts, feelings, and circumstances. So what does that mean? Well, acceptance fundamentally means that you're going to be present with the experience without trying to control or modify it. So one of the tools that I share with my clients is that when you're anxious, there's a few steps to take. The first step is in your mind, just go stop and say it with conviction. The next step is to take a deep breath. This is an abdominal breath. Hold it for 5 seconds and then breathe out slowly for 5 seconds. Now, on the breath out is when we begin to embrace acceptance by actually saying to ourselves, it's okay, I'm feeling anxious, that's all right, I can deal with this. Sit with it. The second part of it is to allow yourself to validate the feeling. It's okay to feel anxious. All of us at some point or another will feel some anxiety. It doesn't mean that there's something necessarily wrong with me, or that I'm broken, or that I'm not good enough. It simply means that I'm anxious. So once we practice letting go of control, which is what we're doing when we take these steps, if I come back to the ball metaphor, is that we allow the ball to take its natural course. We notice that the ball drifts away automatically. And so with anxiety, one of the things that happens, if I don't engage with the thoughts that are creating the anxiety or don't stick with the situation, it will rise and it will fall, a bit like a wave. And it's about riding that wave out, because all feelings, thoughts, tend to be temporary. So it's about really learning how to sit with whatever emotion, with whatever thoughts I'm having, without judging them, without trying to dominate them, without trying to control them. We're no longer pushing them away. We're allowing them to be there. But it also takes me to the next step, which is that I don't need to engage with either my anxiety necessarily or my thoughts, especially the thoughts. Now, it's important to understand that, acceptance doesn't mean that we constantly need to pay attention on our feelings and thoughts. Okay. One of the beautiful things in Zen is that, when we practice Zen or when we practice mindfulness, firstly, we begin to practice in a place of calm and sitting. And that's a really important area in which I will develop my awareness, both of, my sensations in my body, my sense of calm, lots of different aspects of my being. If I'm really sort of pedantic about what is Zen, fundamentally Zen is a calmness of mind, an awareness of my physical sensations, and an observation of interactions between my physical body, the social and physical environment. So there is a really neat little exercise where, you can sit and meditate through, firstly beginning with your breath, but then take your attention to the furthest sound that you can hear in the distance, as far as you can go. And then stay with that attention and begin to pay attention to sounds closer and closer and closer to you. Just simply observe, don't judge it. Initially it's like, oh, I can hear a car. Well, there are sirens. I wonder what's going on there. But eventually the whole experience becomes one of sitting and being mindful, being just able to stay with awareness rather than with judgment or with an attempt to control, whether that's in my inner world or my experience of the outer world. So this is a really good practice, because ultimately in relationships it's often very important to be able to suspend in my communication and in my relationship with the other those judgments and those attempts to control either my own reaction or the other person's reaction. And like the ball in the water, inevitably the ball bounces back up with force, and sometimes hits me in the face. So really, it's an interesting exercise to do, and as a human being, practicing being, or just being, ultimately, I want to be able to get that in place. Now, ultimately, one of the things that I think is really a beautiful aspect to Zen, or the ideas that Zen promote, is that Zen is not an effort. Right? So like the ball, I'm not trying to squeeze it down. Effort is tension. Effort is like work. It's about achieving something. But Zen is not about something to achieve. You are already that. So in the words of Hakuin, just relax. And relax so deeply that you become a revelation to yourself. Because ultimately that's what we're looking to be, is more self-aware. And rather than reactive, as I am in a highly excited or aroused state, I'm going to be more responsive. So I'm going to be, in essence, a more compassionate, tolerant, and responsive human being towards everything that I do, including firstly myself, and then my thoughts, my feelings, my actions, and then my environment. So within that environment, maybe my partner, my kids. So I want you to really reflect on this, and I want you to see, as a point of change, to introduce these ideas into your daily being. They make an enormous amount of difference. People who practice this, and we have stacks of scientific research that shows this, are the people who experience a greater sense of well-being, physically and mentally. There was a point where, this whole practice emerged many, many eons away. And, it's interesting, when I first started practicing as a psychologist and as a therapist, some of these ideas were embedded in the humanistic existential type of psychotherapies, but in a lot of therapies they weren't necessarily even thought through. And the longer and longer we've, been researching and examining what it is that we need to do and be to be well, the more this material became evident. To the point where cognitive behavioral therapy now has an aspect where it's about mindful cognitive behavior therapy. Okay? So it is evidence-based, it is a